Okay, when I say the word alchemy, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably some cloaked figure in a dark lab, right? Obsessed with turning lead into gold. But what if I told you that image isn't just missing a few details? What if it's a story that was deliberately rewritten to hide the truth about the world's very first chemists? Wow, this quote right here gets to the absolute heart of it. It doesn't paint alchemists as frauds at all, but as pioneers. Pioneers whose incredible contributions got totally erased by the very scientific revolution they helped kickstart. So how on earth did their story get so twisted? All right, first up, the myth. Let's dive into that story we all think we know, the one that's all about gold and magic.
Yep, this is the stereotype. The charlatan in a dusty lab, chasing an impossible dream with secret chants and, weird magical rituals. It's a really powerful image, but it's one that's been hiding a much, much more interesting reality.
So let's get to that reality, because when you pull back that mystical curtain, you find something that looks, well, it looks a whole lot like the birth of modern science. Just look at the timeline here. We're talking centuries. Alchemy wasn't some brief fad. It was this long tradition of investigation that spanned the globe. You had key figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan, Paracelsus, and Hennig Brandt, all building on each other's work, creating this growing body of knowledge that would literally become the foundation of chemistry. And what they accomplished was seriously real. I mean, they weren't just mixing random potions. They discovered stuff like aqua regia, the only acid that can actually dissolve gold. They isolated the element phosphorus. Get this, from thousands of gallons of boiled down urine. No joke. They invented essential lab glassware and techniques like distillation that we still use today. But maybe the most important thing of all, they pioneered the experimental method itself, that core idea of testing a theory with an experiment. This wasn't magic. This was science in its infancy.
Okay, so if the alchemists did all this, why do we remember them as frauds? Well, that brings us to what was basically a massive PR campaign. It was less about science and more about rebranding the whole enterprise.
This is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How did the very field that laid the groundwork for modern chemistry become a total joke? The answer, it turns out, has less to do with the facts and way more to do with branding. See, this whole divide was created on purpose. The new kid on the block, chemistry, had to make a name for itself, right? And what's the easiest way to do that? You define yourself against the old guard. So chemistry was sold as scientific, open, and empirical. And alchemy, with all its spiritual goals and secret texts, was painted as its weird, mystical, and totally outdated opposite. The scientific revolution really needed to look legitimate, and alchemy just didn't fit the new brand. Now, to be fair, the alchemists didn't always help their own cause. They deliberately wrote in these bizarre, coded languages, using dragons and lions and all sorts of symbols to stand in for chemicals. For them, it was about protecting their secrets, but for anyone on the outside, it just looked like superstitious nonsense. But the story doesn't stop there, because here's where it gets really wild. Some of the greatest scientific minds in history were secretly alchemists. And in a crazy twist, that one goal that everyone laughed at, well, it turned out to be not so crazy after all. This is absolutely staggering. Isaac Newton, the father of gravity and mechanics, the guy who basically defined the scientific method, he spent more time and wrote more words on alchemy than he did on physics. The man who kicked off the Age of Reason was secretly one of its last great magicians. So that leads us to the biggest question of all. We've been mocking alchemists for centuries for trying to turn one element into another. But what if they were actually onto something? And here it is, the ultimate vindication. Using particle accelerators and nuclear reactors, 20th century scientists finally did it. They changed one element into a completely different one. The alchemist's central goal wasn't impossible. It was just way beyond the technology they had. Just let that sink in for a second. The fundamental idea of alchemy, the very thing that made everyone dismiss it as foolish, has been proven correct. Elements are not fixed. Their methods were a little out there, sure, but their core intuition about how matter works was unbelievably right. And yes, this includes the famous quest for gold. Physicists have actually successfully turned mercury, which is right next to gold in the periodic table, into real, actual gold by bombarding it with neutrons. The ultimate dream of the alchemists is now a physical reality. Of course, There's a catch. And it's a pretty big one. The whole process is incredibly, fantastically expensive. The tiny amount of gold you create is worth just a tiny fraction of what it costs to make it. So while it's scientifically possible, it's still and probably always will be economically impossible. So we've got a field that laid the groundwork for science, got written out of the history books, only to be proven right centuries later. This whole story leaves us with one last, really provocative thought. The story of alchemy is just this powerful reminder of how easy it is for us to dismiss ideas that don't quite fit into our current way of thinking. It really forces you to ask, what other kernels of truth might we be overlooking today, just because they're dressed up in the language of a different time?